Hi, this is Stephen Mead. Over the years, I've read hundreds of books and spent thousands of hours developing what I call the bullseye belief system. And I've used that system to develop my own companies, as well as help others learn to be specific, targeted, and focused to get exactly what they want in life. This is the Bullseye Guy podcast. Stephen Mead, again, back with another Bullseye Guy podcast, and super excited today. Amazing opportunity with Dennis Kucinich coming to us from Cleveland, Ohio. And there's a bunch of fun things we're going to cover with Dennis, including a couple I may or may not get to. There's some fascinating stuff with Dennis and his background and his wife and Elizabeth. So Dennis, appreciate you taking the time. Great to see you. Thank you for joining.
Stephen, thanks so much for giving me a chance to be on your podcast. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, this will be fun. We're going to go through an arc with you, Dennis, everything from growing up in Cleveland, which you've got a fascinating background, to becoming the youngest mayor of a major city, up through presidential candidate, all the way up through what you're doing now, which is great. So from a historical standpoint, give us a little bit of history, just your background growing up and how you started into politics and became really the youngest mayor for a major city in the United States.
Yeah, I grew up the oldest of seven in the city of Cleveland. My dad was a World War II veteran. My mom worked in manufacturing during the war, and then when she met my dad, they started a family. But they fell on hard times pretty quickly. We ended up moving around a lot. My folks never were able to get enough money put together to buy a home. So by the time I was 17, as a result of all the moving around that we did, we lived in at least 21 different places, including a couple cars. And that kind of experience in the inner city, a kind of a nomadic existence within a city, really gave me a perspective on what people go through and how tough it can be for people. So when as I grew up, I decided I wanted to help people like the ones I grew up with. And so I decided early on to go into politics. And when I was 22, I was running for Cleveland City Council for the second time, and won the election and took office at age 23, and went from there to a citywide elected office in charge of the courts, the clerk of the Cleveland Municipal Courts. And 2 years later, I was elected mayor of the city of Cleveland at the age of 31. At the time, Cleveland was over 700,000 people. It was one of the biggest cities. The mayor had total executive authority, over 13,000 city employees, and a lot of physical resources, one of which I pledged to keep, and that was the city's municipal electric system. So that's kind of a quick arc from the neighborhoods of the city to the seat of power inside City Hall at age 31.
Yeah, and this was what was fascinating, Dennis, because you and I had met. We've been in some really global, interesting circles, and we were sitting in Malta, and we'll move forward to this. Some things you've got done around monetary policy and things with Rand Paul. People see you on TV. I was fascinated with why you were interested in some of the new technology, and it really came back to what you were talking about with your childhood. And the 7 kids and the growing up and even the municipal side. And the podcast we've done is really entrepreneurial. So as much as you're comfortable, I'd love for you to share the story again of what happened in Cleveland, because I think that really impacted you. You were fighting for the little guy because of the electricity staying on.
Yeah, I remember it growing up, the trouble that my parents had paying utility bills. And when I became mayor, I was elected on a promise to save the city's municipally owned electric system from a takeover by a utility monopoly. So when I was elected, I canceled a sale that had been ready to go through, that we held up with a referendum petition until I took office. The story should have ended there, but it really just began because the business partner of the utility, which at that point was the largest bank in Ohio, told me on December 15th, 1978, either I would agree to sell the city's municipal electric system to the private utility, or the bank would not renew the city's credit on loans that I hadn't even taken out. So we were put in a squeeze, and it turned out that the bank and the utility were business partners. They had people sitting on the same boards. They were, the bank held the demand deposits for the utility, the pension funds, and a lot of business connections, and stood to profit from trying to force the takeover. So I saved the system from a takeover, but I lost the next election because people didn't really understand why the city of Cleveland was pushed into a financial default. I actually ran the city of Cleveland while reducing spending. I cut the budget by 10% without reducing services, but we didn't borrow any money. Unlike every other city in America, we had our access to credit markets blocked out. But you know, this was years ago, and I did my duty for the people, which was to stand up for their basic economic interests, to have utility rates that were affordable, and to be able to have a choice. In most cases, utility monopolies do not provide people with a choice. Here in Cleveland, people have a choice. I'm talking to you from our home in the city of Cleveland, and we happen to have public power here, and as do over 70,000 other customers in the greater Cleveland, in the Cleveland area. So, you know, I'm very familiar with economic issues. Out of politics, I've had the chance to become involved in monetary issues relating to cryptocurrency. I wrote an unpublished analysis of crypto markets and what I felt were some workable regulations and self-regulatory structures that could help facilitate the use of cryptocurrency and give the public and investors confidence that cryptocurrency was on a level. I also have been involved in business development for many different clients. So, you know, and I've written several books. One called The Courage to Survive is about to be published again in the second edition, which is about growing up in the city of Cleveland. It's a beautiful story. That is a real credit to my parents, how they kept everything together as the family went from one travail after another. And finally, Stephen, I just finished work on a 600-page book about the battle that happened in Cleveland, where Cleveland became the first city to default in the great, you know, since the Great Depression, pushed into a financial default because I didn't accept the extortion from certain banking interests there. So, you know, there's, my life is full. It's fun, except for this pandemic. I'd be out and around right now, but in as much as we're experiencing it, like everyone else and your viewers, I'm being cautious.
And that's what I was so fascinated, Dennis, when you and I met and really had a chance to talk. And that's what I wanted to get across here, is because we see politicians, we see people on TV, but we don't always understand the motivation. And you, with the principles, because of growing up with 7 kids and watching your parents struggle, even you told me when we were sitting again in Malta around cryptocurrency, you said pennies mattered, and the pennies of an electricity bill mattered. And you've been so driven and motivated by things that I don't think people understand. And that's what I really wanted to learn about and share with people, is you've got this amazing motivation that's driven you through an amazing career in politics, but it starts from the way you grew up.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Absolutely. And this isn't important just for myself. You think about every young person out there, what kind of events in their lives imprint upon the kind of person they'll become. I mean, my background was, thanks to my mom, full of literature. I learned to read by the time I was 3 years old, and that opened up the entire world for me. And
yeah,
then
and go ahead.
then I had you call it religious education, 11 years of, 11 and a half years of a Catholic school education, which I actually ended up paying for by working off my book bill in the school and that of my siblings. And I learned self-reliance. I learned from an early age to be able to scramble and put together whatever money was needed at the moment to try to, whether it was carrying groceries and bringing some money home, earned from that, being a stock boy, being a caddy at a golf course, delivering newspapers. I mean, there's so many different ways out there to make money. And I learned that at a very early age. I became very resourceful. And it's really interesting when you take that approach to life. It's almost magical that no matter how tough things are, you always find a way to survive.
And as an entrepreneur, again, I know things personally about you, Dennis, that I'm so impressed by that I don't think other people do. And I'm going to extract them out of you. These decisions when you were mayor of Cleveland, you at a young age in a seat of power, you were given a decision and you were forced into bankruptcy. And that really created, you've told me, a 10, 12, 15-year exile. There were a lot of things that happened to you. As an entrepreneur, you made a very tough decision, and it impacted you for a decade. Can you talk about that for a little bit? Because that, I think,
yeah, I was, keep this in mind. I mean, when I was elected mayor of Cleveland, at that time, I was the youngest big city mayor in America. And the trajectory of my political career, people were looking, the sky was the limit. And, I was, needless to say, I was very aware of that. At the same time, I had commitments to keep to the people who elected me. So I wanted to make sure that they were never cheated, that they got full value for their tax dollars, and that what belonged to them, the assets of the city, were not just given away, which is why I took the stand to save their electrical system, because at that time it was providing electricity for people in the city at a savings of anywhere from 20 to 25%. Pennies matter. So I knew when I refused to sell, and it wasn't just pressure from the business community, this pressure came from the media as well, because the media was getting advertising contracts from the private utility and from the bank that was pushing this sale. And so I had economic power that was weighing against me as well, and the political power, because both political parties were pushing for the sale of this electric system. And the story that I tell in a book where the working title is called The Division of Light and Power is one of how reality kept getting turned inside out, where those who were in charge of the media would cover things to the benefit of the private utility and the bank, and would just distort what was happening. The media made it seem as though I had no choice but to sell. And then when I refused to sell, it became, people were asking me, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you sell? It's like everything's falling apart. The whole city's going to go broke if you don't sell. I mean, it was all a pretext, because the city had all kinds of resources that we could have used to pay off, if we had to pay off the debts to the banks. And banks don't call loans on cities willy-nilly. It doesn't happen, but they called the loans to the city when I was the mayor in order to force my hand. And if we had to pay off the loans, we had city revenues, we had income tax, we had property we could sell. They wouldn't take it. The only thing they would accept is if I sold the city's electric system to their business partner.
Wow.
So, I mean, this was really an unprecedented moment in American history. And what it all came down to, Stephen, was, what did I stand for? Who was I? Did I really believe that I was there to represent the interests of the people, or should I just take a political opportunity here and make friends with some of the most powerful interests in the state at the expense of the people who elected me, who I had promised and made a commitment to that I would save their electric system? And I kept my promise to the people. The city was placed in a technical financial default in a way that had never happened in the country's history and hadn't happened since. And I lost the next election, and I began a period of a descent politically. I couldn't get elected in anything for the longest time. I was out of public life, and when I finally made a recovery, it was to a lower level office, and it took years beyond that to finally make a full comeback. But you know, I made a choice. You make your choices, and you live with the choices you make, and I never regretted it. I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to serve, because not only, you know, did I start off in city council and clerk of courts and mayor, but when people finally realized in Cleveland that the decision I made saved the city hundreds of millions of dollars, I suppose by now $750 million on electric bills and street lighting and things like that, people were very grateful. And so, you know, I won election to the state Senate in a year where I was the only Democrat statewide to win a state election. I one of the few nationally in 1994, and in 96, I was one of, I believe, 3 Democrats nationally who defeated Republican incumbents. Not that I targeted a particular party, but it just was a fact. And so I started, my career started to go back up. And then from 96, I served 16 years in the United States Congress and ran for president twice. But the guiding principles that brought me into politics, that took me out of politics, brought me back, still animate my interest in public service. And that is, tell the truth, be straight, don't put the interest of a particular special group above that of your constituents, and never fear. Don't be afraid.
Yeah, it's again, because the entrepreneurial side of you was what I was so fascinated by. And then the underlying motivations, I think is such a great story that, you know, when people see you, because you're still on television a lot, we've got the clips from you on stage, you know, the 2 times you ran for president, which are fascinating. But what you've reminded me of, Dennis, it's not the best. It's like the old days of Mad Men, where you and Newt Gingrich and some of these older politicians, you were the last great generation of guys who, even though you didn't disagree on policy, still could work together. And there's a lot of things that I think you've learned in your past that you're bringing forward to today. So talk to me a little bit about how politics has changed, but how you still have the roots of how you've operated.
Well, the first thing is you've got to be very careful in life. I'm not just talking about politics. If you have disagreements with people, it should never be personal. Don't make enemies. If you're in a situation where you have to take a strong position, I had to do that in Cleveland years ago. Don't hold a grudge. Don't let any bad feelings ever be held in your heart, because it weighs you down.
Yeah.
And it's spiritually dangerous to do that. So I found that it's very easy for me to talk to people of any political persuasion. While I'm a Democrat, I know very well that the Democratic Party or any party politics is not exactly the font of love and mercy and gentility, that you have to stand for something. So I respect people, even though we may have differences of opinion. I always try to find a place where we might be able to meet and work on something else. You know, people aren't always going to agree with you, but if you find there'll be something you can agree on, and you find that, and you try to make things happen, and always try to build personal relationships, because if it's all political, it's stupid. It's vacuous and goes nowhere. It's more important to find out about the people who you might work with, and to find out which, you know, is there a way you might be able to help them? Is the reciprocity that comes in politics is really through the science of human relations. You don't make, everything isn't a knockdown, drag 'em out fight. I don't think it was ever intended to be. You just had, and that's I think a big lesson in politics. I work with people on both sides of the aisle. I don't really care about partisanship. It's really of no interest to me.
Yeah, and that's what I said from the people I know as well in the circles. You're always given credit as one of the last great congressman who was able to cross that aisle and do things. And I want to come back to that because I know that impacts a lot of what you're doing now that I want to talk about. But I'm also fascinated. We don't get this opportunity too often. What was your motivation for running for president twice, and what did you learn by running 2 different cycles?
I ran twice in order to stop the United States from getting involved in all these crazy wars. I didn't realize until I got to Congress how President Eisenhower's warning of beware of the military-industrial complex was an ever-present admonition to anyone who holds federal office in the United States. Because, I just saw one war come after another. And I analyzed the call for war when the administration, right after 9/11, went after Iraq. And if someone was to go to the web today and type in Kucinich, Iraq War Analysis, October 2nd, 2002, you would find out that before the Congress passed the resolution to go to war against Iraq, that I had spot on exposed that there was no legitimate reason for that attack on Iraq. There was no reason for us to go to war. And yet, after Afghanistan and Iraq and some other adventures were, the American taxpayers have forked over $6 to $7 trillion, totally wasted, lost, the cost of lives of way over 1 million people and a number of American troops. What for? So, when I got into Congress, I found out how government lies to people all the time.
Yeah.
They try to take us into wars. And when they don't tell us the truth about that, it causes destructive undermining of public confidence. So, that was really the biggest lesson that I learned, Stephen. The extent to which government will lie to to cover up, keep a war going. It's really repugnant. And, it's still going on today. At this moment, it's going on today. And
that's what I was going to say is let's switch gears to a different MIC that you and I have an interest in. And my definition of MIC, so the military industrial complex, government's big on acronyms, and I get it. There's a different MIC I see going on, and one that not only I know you have an interest in, this is what I want to transition and talk about because I want people to understand your thinking in this. The MIC I'm referring to is the monetary industrial complex. With what's going on with the Fed and the printing of money and your interest in some of the blockchain and the technologies, not cryptocurrency as an investment, but the structural side. When you and I talked, I was fascinated with your thoughts around that because the banking side and the dissemination of the Fed, you've got some really thoughtful insights on it.
Well, thank you. And here's, I actually met my wife, Elizabeth, on the issue of monetary.
Awesome, by the way, Elizabeth, hi.
She's on a call in another room. And she brought to me the thinking of a person by the name of Stephen Zarlenga, who founded the American Monetary Policy Society. And what Zarlenga did in dozens of years of research was to expose what other monetary masters know. And that is the ballgame changed in 1913 in the United States with the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. Before that, the government, under the Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 8, had the ability to coin or create money to meet the needs of the country. After 1913, the government had to start borrowing money from banks in order to meet the needs of the country, and the Fed was the one that acted as the agent. Through fractional reserve banking, banks were able to pyramid any of the borrowing that went on. And the Fed itself was able to, through quantitative easing, create money out of nothing. They did it in the 2007-2008 meltdown, protected the banks, but Main Street saw millions of homes crushed with debt. Today, banks are propping up the finance. and Wall Street, or rather the Fed is, and the government really isn't doing a sufficient job to protect the interest of Main Street, which, when you consider the economy is 70% consumer spending, you wonder what's going on here. So, my feeling is that the government needs to reclaim the ability to be able to meet the needs of the country, and not always be at the risk of speculation and financialization, which is really the casino that the country's become.
Yeah.
And taxpayers end up bailing out. Now, the connection with cryptocurrency and all this, and really, when you look at the pandemic, hey, I'll tell you, I think paper money is going to start to go out, and it's going to be replaced by digital money, and the implications are going to be extraordinary. I mean, China right now is looking at digitizing its national currency, and I think there has to be some rules of the road if you're talking about cryptocurrency. But to me, it would not be unthinkable in the not too distant future to have people being given a card with an electronic balance on it and be able to draw down from it, and to have currency take place, exchanges take place digitally. They do on one level, but in communities, and to have the government either have major players in cryptocurrency or have the government issuing its own digital currency itself. The monetary policy is a very arcane area, and I don't pretend to be an expert, but I sure know how money is doled out to interest groups at the expense of the long-term needs of communities like the one I live in.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because the monetary side again, and I draw distinctions because we're deep in this space. So cryptocurrency to me, just in my own vernacular, cryptocurrency to me is glorified penny stocks. It's things that are traded. Digital currency, a lot of times people go, oh, the world's not going to go digital. I say, well, you have a debit card. A debit card technically is already digital money, but the digital currency side of that is issued and controlled by the banking systems. Then you've got a digital currency like a Bitcoin. I'm not saying it's a full-on currency, but you've got certain autonomous things that allow you to do payment outside of any banking structure. Digital currency inside the banking structure is to me a glorified debit card. It has some cool functionality for quicker settlement. In your world, Dennis, in your mind, what's the aspect of payment occurring outside of a structure like the Federal Reserve or the government or a bank?
I think there is legitimacy there, because it's about freedom. Ultimately, people not being bound by financial systems, but creating systems of value exchange that can be digitized. And that's the future.
Yeah.
Control of money by a central authority is always going to be rife with politics and with favors. And what I have felt is that if we had self-initiating standards or self-executing rules that people could agree to basically, here's the principles that we will use as in our use of cryptocurrency. You give public trust, because really that currency has to have trust behind it. It's not for any small reason that the dollar bill itself has "In God We Trust" on it. There's trust is a significant factor here, but freedom is also a significant factor.
Yeah.
And the thing that always appealed to me in the cryptocurrency realm was that there was this dimension of freedom, of being able to transact things without necessarily having being inhibited in your trade. Now, there are tax laws that can can be executed through blockchain. There are prohibitions against money laundering that can and should be observed. But cryptocurrency is a place for massive creativity, and I'd like to see that space protected. The other side of it we have to be aware of is, to be sure, the cryptocurrency market is no more immune from the kind of manipulations that take place with value than the stock market itself.
Yeah. And that was the arc I wanted to cover with you, because when you and I were talking about this, I wanted to understand, because it's a very libertarian kind of view. When you've been a lifelong Democrat, I didn't know how to marry those two. And then when I learned about your history growing up and as a kid and what happened to you in Cleveland, it makes sense. And so what I think you bring to the industry that I'd love people to know about you is you've got a perspective where you believe in the jurisdictional side of currency, but you also believe very heavily, because of your background, in the aspect of pulling it outside. And you've got one of the most unique perspectives on the planet, because I think it is something that has benefit, but it does need structure. And I don't call it regulation, I call it a framework. It needs a framework of structure.
I've actually written that framework. I haven't published it.
And I've seen it. We've tried to help you edit it, and that's again why I wanted to bring some of this stuff up. You've got a
it's almost a 100-page document that that is a tour de force of the market, and at the same time, it just gets very practical about how is there a way to self-regulate, and I think there is.
Yeah.
Because the creativity that's imminent in cryptocurrency can easily be crushed through people. Through bad actors and government responding to bad actors by just crushing the whole industry.
Yeah, I agree, and that's what I really want to push people towards you on, because I've spent enough time. It's amazing. Just a couple 2 minutes left. I want to be respectful of your time, but I want your insight, Dennis. We're in the middle of COVID. Hopefully, we're not in the middle. We're at the beginning of the end of the beginning of this new normal. With COVID, what do you see the next 6, 12, 9 months, either politically or personally or changing in society? I'm just kind of curious what you sort of see some of the new normal coming out of this being.
Well, all of our lives are in some ways contracting, in other ways they're becoming enriched, because we're having an opportunity to spend more time with people and to build relationships in whatever way that we can. I think on a philosophical level, it could result in people finding deeper meaning in their lives. But on a practical economic level, it's going to be hell for a lot of people. There's going to be a lot of bankruptcies, there'll be foreclosures, people be evicted, no matter what the prohibitions are, because our society is not set up to deal with these kind of pandemics. We're always, and for the next few years, we're going to be dealing with everything after the fact. This thing could be with us for a while. I'm not a doctor, but I know enough to know that if there's something that's I could get by being in crowds, I'm not going into crowds. You couldn't pay me to do it. And so I think it's been well established that you move around in crowds until this thing disappears, you could catch the virus. I don't have any interest in doing that. Now, I'm on the other hand, it's not for me to tell others this is what you have to do. But you sure need to make the case that, look, you go in a crowd, you could pick something up, you could bring it home, you could kill somebody you love. And so, that's enough for me to say, hey, slow down. So what do I think prospectively? I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know, Stephen. We're headed to a very tough period.
Yeah.
On the other side of it, there's going to be a chance for a lot of creativity. Businesses will rise up that would have never otherwise come forward to provide services and health and a whole range of possibilities to people. We're communicating over technology that a couple of years ago wasn't much, but now it's the way that people communicate. There's changes that are happening. I think the most important thing is each of us has to be as president of our own lives. We have to make our own executive decisions on what's right for us and ourselves and our family. And hopefully everyone gets through this period. The country, though, is going to have to rework the way it functions. It cannot just have the Fed bailing out hedge funds or triple B investments that were just barely hanging on by their fingernails. It can't be the government permitting the casino to run and you forget Main Street. Yeah. People are going to have, if this kind of climate continues, there's going to have to be monthly payments made to people just so they can survive. If people have to survive, there's going to have to be a healthcare system that isn't based on profit so people can survive. I mean, those are things that are not rocket science. I'm very practical. I'm not ideological. And I look as a practical matter. We've got to address, how do you put money into people's hands in the 70% consumer economy? How do you stop people from losing their homes or losing the roof over their head that they're renting? I mean, these are practical questions. Yeah. And that's where my focus is going to be for the next couple of years.
Yeah, well, amazing. Dennis, again, I love you and Elizabeth. I appreciate your time. You've always been amazing and gracious. And I really wanted this opportunity to get more of the insight of you and your background, because I think you've just had an amazing course of history. And I still think you have a lot to share and do and bring to this world. And I'll be excited to see it happen. So thank you for everything.
We'll talk soon. Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Again, guys, Stephen Meade, the Bullseye Guy. Tune in next week. We'll have another great interview. Dennis Kucinich, two-time presidential candidate, congressman, youngest mayor, and now entrepreneur changing the world. Thanks, Dennis.